What I'd like to do, really, in introduction to next week's class, is spend a little bit of time trying to understand the significance of the land of Israel. I'm fairly certain, if you're in this room, you probably believe that Israel is important. Can you articulate why? I think many of us would say, depends who's asking, the history, it's our homeland, it's a place we lived. Is there something deeper? Is there another way of looking at it? And it's fascinating. I find it fascinating. There are really a number of very different approaches among the commentators tackling why the land of Israel is so important. Okay, so that's a goal. Hopefully walk away today with a couple of answers, a couple of understandings of why Israel is so significant. Let's jump in. The starting point really is the end of not this week's Torah portion, but it takes place really 2 weeks ago, where it talks about the laws of the forbidden relationships. Relationships like incest, adultery, those are forbidden relationships. And the Torah does something very interesting. It says that it's important to stay away from these sins. Okay, I am God, don't do them, it's immoral. But he said there's a threat. If you don't keep these mitzvos, if you're not careful in this area, then the land, the term that's used is the land will vomit you out. The land will vomit you out. You will not be able to stay in Israel. The land will vomit you out. And one of the things we could start wondering about, which we'll hopefully come back to, is, there's certain laws that pertain to the land of Israel proper. For example, any examples of lands that... Sorry, Shemitah, right? The sabbatical year. We don't do sabbaticals over here. Work sabbaticals maybe, but we don't do a land sabbatical. If you have some planting in your backyard, you keep going. We just had a Shemitah year. We just had a sabbatical year. No problem. In Israel, that is something which pertains to Israel. So there we can understand if a person misuses the gift they were given, i.e. the land of Israel, okay? They're not doing the mitzvahs they were commanded to do. We can understand a person be kicked out of the land of Israel. What's weird, what's strange, is that the mitzvah of staying away from sexual immorality, that's not a land-related mitzvah. That is something which relates to me as an individual, you as an individual. What is the connection between, if you don't keep these mitzvos, God will kick you out of the land? It seems a little odd. Again, and next, just to emphasize this point, in next week's Torah portion, there's going to be a whole long list of, bad things that happen to you, and the emphasis is because you didn't keep Shemitah. You're going to be kicked out of the land, you're going to be exiled, you didn't take care of the gift I gave you, the land, you got to leave. Got it. But what is the connection between these mitzvahs, which are more about me as an individual, you as an individual? How does that relate to the land itself? That's a question we ultimately will come back to. Okay, we'll keep that question in the back of our minds. Let's jump into a couple of different approaches regarding the significance of the land of Israel. Okay? Here we go. So the first is something that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks shares. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks is, I think we could easily say, probably the leading one of the leading Jewish thinkers of the latter part of the 20th century, or the late 20th century, early 21st century. And he has, let's see what he writes, and then we'll unpack this a little bit. He says, taken collectively, the commandments of the Torah are a prescription for the construction of a society with the consciousness of God at its center. Okay, a society needs a land, a home, a location in space where a nation can shape its own destiny in accord with its deepest aspirations and ideals. Jews are the people of the covenant, charged with bringing the divine presence down to earth in the shared space of our collective life. Okay, so to say it in our words, not in Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' flighty, lofty, eloquent words, the reason we need a land is because the Torah is a book that is directed not only at individuals, this is how you are a moral person, but rather the Torah is trying to paint a picture of a moral society. The only way a moral society is going to function is if it has a place to be a society. It can't be a society in thin air. You need a land. And therefore, in order for there to be a holy society, in order for us to fulfill the Torah properly, we need a land. Now, if we just take the statement on its own, according to Rabbi Sacks, just the statement on its own, doesn't matter where that land is. If Rabbi Sacks is one of those voting in one of the early Zionist Congress meetings when they brought up the possibility of having Uganda as the land of Israel, what would Rabbi Sacks vote? Based on this alone, he would say you need a land. A land. He doesn't say there's anything significant about this land. I'm not suggesting that's what he would do. I'm just pointing out that based on this alone, it would just be, you need a land to function as a society. Judaism is not meant to be an individualized. Judaism is not only family-centered, it's society-centered. And therefore, we need to have a society to function together. You need a land. It doesn't necessarily have to be the land of Israel necessarily. Now, again, this is just one quote, but I think it's worth something thinking about, and someone should probably and could write a thesis on this. I'm not an expert in Rabbi Sacks' writings. I'm sure everyone here has read a lot of Rabbi Sacks, just I don't know, that's what people do. He doesn't speak about Israel a lot. He really doesn't speak about Israel a lot. It's not front and center in his writings. He's written numerous books about all the major things in Israel. He doesn't focus on Israel a whole lot. Probably in one place where I'm told this is that he had the most focused discussion of Israel, it's more a critique about what Israel could and should be, as opposed to what Israel is. Now, again, it's hard to therefore say this is his ideology, but he is not like your typical Zionist in the sense that he is not. Again, he loved Israel. There's no question about it. He believed in the importance of Israel, but he doesn't often talk about Israel as a central part of our identity. The one place where he has a long sustained discussion about Israel is in a book he wrote, Future Tense, and he writes a very interesting critique, which it's worth reading if you just look at the next source over there, right? Jonathan Sachs from Future Tense. He writes like this: the first challenge of Zionism, the creation of a Jewish state, has been achieved. He points out in this article there are two challenges of Zionism. One is the actual land. Done. Thank God. We have a land. 1948. Wonderful. The second, the creation of a Jewish society, has hardly begun. What would this involve? First, the construction of a national narrative. Okay, then here's where the critique gets heavy. If the United States needs a national narrative and borrows biblical Israels for the purpose, should Israel itself not do so? Nor need the narrative be exclusive to Israel's Jewish citizens. National narratives can be, indeed must be, inclusive. Again, we are in the presence of surpassing irony. For it is the United States, whose political system is predicated on the separation of church and state, that evolved a national narrative based on the biblical idea of covenant. It is not about the state. It is about values higher than the state. Okay, so he points out, and this is a longer discussion, but something to think about. He points out that in some ways America, certainly the early establishment of America, and even just the notion of a covenant, the notion of this relationship between we the people, and there's this relationship between us and the government, and it's not government people, but rather people government, and this tension and dynamic between them, that he argues is much more of a Jewish idea, and the founding fathers of the United States were all heavily influenced and borrowed heavily from the Bible and the Torah, whereas in Israel, maybe in the past 10 years, you're finding more and more Judaism playing front and center. The early fathers of Israel kind of pushed that away. You know, they were knowledgeable in Tanakh, don't get me wrong, and they were knowledgeable in the Bible, but it wasn't something they pushed front and center. It was not about the Torah. The Torah didn't play such a central role in the establishment of the state. So again, I just mentioned this, something to think about. Rabbi Sachs's view on Zionism. Is he a Zionist? What type of Zionist is he? I'm not saying anything definitive. It's worth, if you're bored and you want to write a PhD, go for it. This might be it. Okay, but the point is, Rabbi Sachs's argument is, the reason we have the land of Israel is because we need a land. Technically, theoretically, it could be any land. Let's now move on to Professor Yehuda Elitzur, who writes as follows: why were you brought to this land? Because here you are dependent upon divine providence. This is Scripture's definition, stated in the lofty and poetic style which characterizes it. Had we asked a Jew of the old style for his definition, his answer would have been, this is a land where one can only survive on miracles. So he suggests, there's a term, what he's basing this on is a verse in the Torah which says that God's eyes are always in the land of Israel. God is always watching the land of Israel. What does that mean? God is watching everything. So when I say I'm really focusing on something, that means I need your attention. I need you to watch over it. He says Israel has always been surrounded by enemies. This is not a new thing. Hezbollah, Hamas, it's always been from day one. We walked in, they were there. There were other people there. Canaanites were there. But even when they got rid of the Canaanites, you had Edom over here, and you had Amalek over here, and you had Moab over here, and Ammon over here, and they didn't like the Jews. And they liked the Jews, and they harassed them, and until King David comes along, they're harassing them nonstop, and then King David's gone, and more or less within a few generations, it's a mess again. They're always surrounded by danger. Not only are they surrounded by military concern, they're also surrounded by, they also have a never-ending, until maybe modern times, concern about a lack of sustenance. Many of them were farmers, and you're completely dependent on rain. That's tricky. Rain's not in your control. And therefore, until, maybe now you have a startup nation, it's a little bit different, but certainly during that time, they were completely dependent on God. So says Professor Elitzur, you know why God chose Israel? Precisely for all the challenges. Precisely for all the challenges because, the person who recognizes, I always find like people who don't get, I find, this might, again, I don't know. I guess I'm in an academic, pretending to be an academic mindset. But if you want to make a study, I'd be curious to know people in business versus people getting a regular paycheck. People who are run their own businesses. Who has more faith in God?
run their own business.
People run their own business, right? In other words, they're much more, they realize much more. A person gets a regular paycheck. Okay, it's coming. Okay, obviously I know deep down it doesn't have to come, but I'm not thinking about it. A person who it's all on them and they recognize like one day it's great and one day it's not, like what in the world? That person, so you live in Israel, you are by definition, because of its danger, because of the precarious nature of the land of Israel, they are constantly, everyone must be thinking about God. How could you survive without it? How can you survive without it? So he says the reason Israel is chosen is due to all of its challenges. Its challenges are not a bug, they are a feature, right? They're not an issue with the land of Israel, they are a feature of the land of Israel. It's a challenging place to live, and precisely because of that, it ensures that its inhabitants are thinking about the fact that they're not in control and someone else is. So that's his approach, which is a fascinating insight. Okay, writes Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, he writes as follows. Let's read the whole passage and I'll explain. So he says, the tumah of the inhabitants brings tumah also to the land. There's nus, which means sexual immorality, makes the land too a zonah. This relationship of man to land applies everywhere on earth. Okay, so he begins by addressing the question we began with, which is, why does the people's engagement in sexual immorality, how and why does that impact their connection to the land? And he says, what's the question? People and the land that they live in have a relationship. The way there's a dynamic between land and person. And from an etymology, from the perspective of etymology, he writes, the entire earth is called Adamah, right? That's the Hebrew term we use for earth. As its name implies, it is the basis for man's development, right? What do we call humans? Adam, right? And so, of course, the Torah tells us why we call Adam, because we're earth from the land. But obviously, it must be deeper than that. In other words, like, I don't say that this thing is called a battery because part of it is made up of a battery. Like, unless the battery was its central feature, I wouldn't call it that. The fact that we call ourselves Adam, and it's associated with Adamah, that means that there's something deep that really connects us to the land. And we don't have to get so mystical to appreciate this. I just came back from Israel, right? I'll give you a good example. I used to run a traveling camp for like kids at risk, kids who need to get out of town a little bit for their summers. And it was before we had phones that gave us directions. So I used to print, remember MapQuest? I remember that thing. So I used to print out, we had a binder filled with all the directions, and we used to sit there like scrambling through. This is like, we didn't have to use maps, right? We thought we were like, this is amazing. But the kids, and I have a terrible sense of direction, the kids called the camp, the nickname of the camp, they call the camp U-turn, because we constantly be making U-turns all over and over again because we got lost. Okay, so one day, we are somewhere in the Midwest, somewhere like deep in the West. It's a tiny little city, one of these like one light cities or whatever, a small city, okay? And we pull up at a red light and we're lost. And there's a car next to us, so I roll down the window. I say, hey, we're looking for whatever. Can you direct me? Okay, he starts to write slow, Midwestern, like slow drawl, really speaking slowly, very different than the way I speak, right? And he's going, and in the meantime, the light turns green. Okay, so I'm like getting tense now, right? I'm like, he keeps on talking, and it's very helpful, and telling us all directions, but there's a whole line of cars behind us. We are 2 lanes on the main road of the city, right? And I'm clenching the wheel. Not a single honk. The light turns back to red. I kid you not. And there was not a single honk of the horn. Okay? Imagine that happening. I just came back from Israel. They honk the horn before the light turns green. It's like, they're so impatient, right? Forget Israel. New York. I was just in, every place generates a certain culture. There is a relationship, there is a dynamic between land and person. To pretend that we have right, a person living on the West Coast has a different, generally speaking, there's a different culture. And there's a different way of life. People are different depending on where they live, right? So that's what the Rav Hirsch is saying. Yes, the tumah of the person, the impurity, the immorality of the person, it creates a dynamics between them and the land, and therefore it contaminates the land, and the land doesn't want to tolerate contamination. And that's why he's explaining that's how he explains the relationship between personal immorality and the land itself. But then he goes on to say, what is it about Israel? He says, but God has established a much closer relationship between Israel and its land. Okay, he says every land is connected to the person, the people living there, but Israel is special. Why? From the time that Avram was chosen and the land was chosen for him, the land of Israel has not tolerated the corruption of its inhabitants. So Rav Hirsch is suggesting, why is Israel holy? To sum it up in one sentence, because God said so. God chose the land. So he's not suggesting there's something intrinsic to the land of Israel. He's saying, when God chose it, it's whole, it's special because God chose it. It's like my child is special because they're my child. I don't need a reason. I chose. Right? This is my child, so they're special, right? Are they really special? No, objectively, no. But they're my child, so they're special to me, right? The point is that why is the land of Israel holy? because God chose it to be holy. God told Avram, I'm choosing this land. Not necessarily is there anything pre-existing in that land. This land is holy because God chose it to be holy. So Rav Hirsch, a very rational approach, is saying there's nothing intrinsic to this land. There is, of course, a relationship between person and land, but in terms of the intrinsic worth of the land, God chose it. Okay? So again, approach number one is we just need a land. Approach number two is the dangers of this land, the concerns, the precarious nature of living in this land is precisely why God chose it. The third is it's important because God chose it. The fourth approach is going to get us a little bit more mystical. And here I'm just going to summarize because it's sometimes a little bit hard to parse out his words. This is from the poet and philosopher Rav Yehuda Halevi. He was a medieval commentator, and he wrote a book. It's a fascinating book. Anyone ever read the Kuzari? It's a hard book to get through. But basically, it is a book of philosophy. Now, philosophy books are not usually that exciting, right? I don't know, unless you love philosophy, but it's hard to get through a philosophy book. So Rav Yehuda Halevi was also a poet. He wrote a couple of poems that we say on Tisha B'Av, and Ani Kinor, the famous, those are taken from the words of Rav Yehuda Halevi, brilliant poet, Spanish philosopher, Jewish poet. Okay. He wanted to make his book of philosophy a little bit more engaging, so what did he do? He knew of a historical event that took place a few hundred years before him, and that is that about 1,000 years ago, there was this kingdom, where currently Russia is, a kingdom which at least the nobility converted to Judaism, called the Khazar Kingdom. Now, for many years, this was debated. Historians debated if this really took place or not. Recently, they've kind of established, they have some documentation demonstrating that at least the nobility did indeed convert to Judaism. Okay? Now, that's all we know from a historic perspective. The tradition that many Jews have was that the king, the person who was in charge, was going through this religious crisis of faith and trying to figure out which religion to connect to. He wasn't connecting to the ancient religion that he was born into, and he brought in all these priest and imam and whatever, and finally brought in a rabbi eventually, had a dialogue, the rabbi persuaded him, and he converted to Judaism. So that's the tradition. Rav Yehuda Halevi is a very bright philosopher with a creative and with a creative flair. So he says, I'm going to write a philosophy book, like philosophical fiction. In other words, he pretends that this is the dialogue between the rabbi who is arguing with the Khazar king, and this dialogue back and forth. And so it's back and forth. The Khazar king asks a question, and the rabbi answers. It's not the real dialogue that took place 1,000 years ago, but Rav Yehuda Halevi uses that story as the backdrop for his book of philosophy. Anyway, in that book, Rav Yehuda Halevi speaks about the land of Israel, and he tries to explain what the land of Israel is. And again, he's quite a mystic, and he uses an analogy which already is touched upon in the book of Isaiah and Yeshaya, and that is a vineyard. In Judea, which is where Isaiah lived, vineyards were people had vineyards. Vineyards were very common. Now, we're back to a time where you go. There are many different wineries that are popping up in Israel throughout the Judean territory. And so Isaiah uses an analogy about the Jewish people and the land of Israel using grapes. And the way Rav Yehuda Halevi explains it is as follows. He says, to make good wine, you need three features. One, you need to have a really good, what's the name of the person who works with the vineyards? Vintner. Thank you. You need a great vintner. You need to be qualified. Okay? You also need to have good grapes, right? Depends on the grapes you're using. It's going to make a difference. And lastly, you also need the right soil, right? There's a reason that you probably have never had Baltimore wine. If you have, you probably didn't remember it, because there's nothing special. You grow grapes over here. There's nothing special about the soil. I grew up in Montreal, okay, not known for their wine, but I had a neighbor, an Italian guy, who was retired, and he would spend the entire day, every day in the summer, working on his vineyard. He looked like he knew what he was doing. I have no idea. I'm sure these were great grapes brought in from Italy or whatever. But I imagine, right, it just didn't taste the same as it did if he would have planted it in Italy. You need all three features.
What about the weather?
The weather, right? The weather plays a difference. It's the soil, meaning it's the whole the avira. It's the whole nature, right? The place you're planting it in. So says Rav Yehuda Halevi, that idea is essentially, he says, let's take this analogy and apply to us. He says the Jewish people are like good grapes. There's something intrinsic. We have a heritage that we inherited, spiritual heritage that we inherited, and therefore we are like the good grapes. But good grapes on their own is meaningless. If I go ahead and plant some grapes in my backyard, or even if I lived in California or whatever, it won't come out because I have no idea what I'm doing, right? So you need to prune them. You need to be able to deal with them. The pruning is the mitzvot. The pruning are the commandments which help form us, right? They have to be done properly, right? But then there's a last feature. The last feature is, where are you planting them in? And you can plant them in one place, it'll come out very differently than planting them somewhere else. The land of Israel is the ideal soil for spiritual growth. And that's the trifecta. You need to have the good grapes. That's the Jewish people. You need to have the mitzvot, the proper pruning, etc. But it has to be done in the right place, and that is the significance of the land of Israel. The land of Israel, in as much as, let's say, we believe in some unique soul that a Jewish person has, the land of Israel has a unique soul as well. It's the only place that's able to produce it has the right climate, the right spiritual climate to bring about the right fruit. So again, according to him, if you're to ask him, what's special about the land of Israel? It's intrinsic. There is something there deeply embedded. It's equivalent. It's like saying, what's the difference between planting wine in Baltimore versus, Northern California? Northern California, right? It's a world of a difference, right? Similarly, doing a mitzvah in Baltimore is not the same as doing a mitzvah in Israel. The produce, the sum total, what it produces is going to be very different. Questions, thoughts? Okay. With that in mind, let's go on to the Ramban, Nachmanides. By the way, just to mention, postscript over here, the end of the book of the Kuzari, the king in this book asks the rabbi, says, hey, you're talking about Israel always. You keep on coming back to Israel. You don't live there. What's going on? You all talk. And the rabbi says, you got me, right? It's like the end of the book. He's like, you got me. I had answers to all your questions. I don't have a good answer. I should live in Israel. It's dangerous, this and that. Again, he's writing this in the 1300s. It's dangerous, this and that. I should go there, you're right. And we have a tradition. We know that Yehuda Halevi, the author, ultimately does travel to Israel. There is like an apocryphal story that he gets there, he bows down. When he hits like people used to do when they used to have the planes, he used to walk onto the tarmac, remember that? So he went down and kissed the ground, and a horseman trampled him under him. That's the apocryphal story. There's no historical record for that. We know he traveled to Israel. We're not sure if he made it. He either died right upon getting there or right before. Seems like he didn't ultimately make it to Israel. Okay. Let's talk about the Ramban. The Ramban Nachmanides also made a pilgrimage to Israel, really moved to Israel. The reason he moved to Israel is because he was chased out of his home. He also lived in Spain. He was forced, famously, to get into an argument, to have a public disputation with a man by the name of Pablo Cristiani. He was an apostate Jew, a former Jew, turned Christian, and Nachmanides was forced to have a debate, a public debate. Nachmanides did not want anything to do with this. He was first of all, he was an elderly statesman at the time. He was like 72, I want to say. I forgot exactly. 78. Keep in mind, back then, now 72 is like the new 20. Back then, right? Okay, yeah. Okay, but back then, 72 was like that was people weren't living that long at all, right? And he basically had this debate. When it was all said and done, he basically, the church wanted to have him executed because of the things that he said, and so he was tipped off, different recordings of exactly how it happened, whether he was given permission to leave or he ran. One way or another, he had to leave Spain, he had to leave his family, he had to leave his community, and he travels to Israel. Okay, ultimately travels to Jerusalem. There is a Ramban shul in Jerusalem right now. It's not the original, but it was the place where he built a shul. He really rebuilt the Jerusalem community when he got there. Maybe next week we'll come back to that a little bit. But here, in this piece, he talks about the holiness of Israel. And here he says something which is pretty wild, pretty wild. So he says like this: "Vatitzmah haaretz." I have the Hebrew and the translation underneath. Let's just read the translation. Okay, it says, "The land became contaminated and accounted for the sins upon it, and the land vomited." Those are the verses that I mentioned earlier, that when people engaged in immorality, the land vomited them out. So he says, the verse is very, excuse the language, he's writing, obviously a very different writing style, but we'll understand what he means. The verse is very stringent regarding sexual immorality that contaminates the land and vomits out the people who engage in such things. But sexual immorality pertains to one's body and is not dependent on the land. Again, that's the question we asked when we began. The matter is that Hashem created everything and placed a force above and gave each nation a land, a star, or constellation, as it is known in astrology. Okay, so the Ramban is an astrologist and a mystic, and he understands that, God runs the world, granted, but God does not interact directly with the world. God has, we'll call some form of an intermediary to allow the world to connect to him. The analogy I always think of is let's say I have my phone over here, let's say the battery is getting low, which it is, and I want to plug it in. So let's say I was traveling and I'm a block away from a nuclear plant. And my phone is dead. It's like, I have a good idea. I'm going to plug it into the nuclear plant. It creates energy, right? And I'll be able to get my phone fully charged. What would happen if I plug my phone into the center of this nuclear plant? It'll blow up. Can't survive. Too much, Too much. So how do we get our phones charged? What happens is that it goes from a nuclear power plant, and then it goes into those boxes that are on the corner of our, it goes through the wires, goes to those boxes on the corners of our blocks called a transformer. And what the transformer does, it takes the electricity and breaks it into smaller packets, so it's much more, adaptable. And then it goes further wires and goes into our homes. It breaks it down further, and by the time I put my plug into the wall, it's bringing a tiny little packet of electricity and allows my phone to not blow up when I plug it in. Okay? That is how the mystics understand the function of angels and these forces in the world. God is hot stuff. The world can't connect to God. The only way that God is going to connect to the world is if you have these intermediaries, you have these things in between that kind of break things down, like these allow, for us to get the energy from God. It's only going to work through these intermediaries. Now, in the mystical world, these intermediaries, these angels have a little bit of their own, some level of latitude. They're not completely just like a transformer. Okay, they're beings of some sorts, but ultimately they're subservient to God. They help break the spiritual energy into smaller packets that the world could survive. Okay? So he says every country, Baltimore, Maryland, has its own angel that oversees it. Okay? Fine. He says, however, Hashem is the God of these forces and master of these masters of the entire world. Of course, God is in control of them. However, in the land of Israel, the center of the inhabited world, is God's inheritance designated to him. He did not place an angel as he gave it as an inheritance to his unique nation. He says in the land of Israel, there isn't anything in between. God is somehow, even though it's hard to connect to God, God is directly connected to the world, to the land of Israel. There is no transformer. There is no angel in between. He sanctified the nation that lives in the land with the laws of prohibited relations and most of the mitzvos, so that they would be for him. Okay, I'm going to explain what this means in a moment. This is why it says, and will keep all my decrees and laws and do them, so that the land does not vomit you out. The land which is the inheritance of Hashem vomits anyone who contaminates it. It does not tolerate idolatry and those who engage in sexual immorality. So says the Ramban, you know why we have many of our mitzvos? You know why we have many of our mitzvos? Well, if I were to ask you, why do you have mitzvos? I don't know, so we can be moral people, right? Upstanding people. They change our character, they become better people. We want to be moral. Ramban says no. He says, yes, they do make us better people, 100%. But had we not lived in Israel, we wouldn't actually need them. The reason we have them is because since Israel is such a holy place, the only way we are allowed to stay there, or the only way we're able to be in such a place, is if we up our game, is if we act in a totally different fashion, because the land, because of its proximity to God, because of the fact that we are in God's presence at all times, if we're not acting on this super elevated fashion, we'd be kicked out. Again, the purpose of the mitzvos, the reason of the mitzvos, according to the Ramban, at least most of the mitzvos, is to allow us to stay in the land of Israel, right? If you're in your room, you're gonna act very differently. If you're in the queen, the king's palace in England, you have to act with a certain protocol, right? If you don't act that protocol, you gotta leave. What are you doing over here, right? You gotta dress a certain way. You gotta act in a certain way. If you're not, it's not for you. You gotta leave, right? So if we're in the land of Israel, we're in God's palace. That's where the mitzvos comes from. The vast majority of mitzvos, it says most of the mitzvos are given to us so that we are acting on the right stature to be in the land of Israel. Okay? Let's keep on reading. Outside the land, next paragraph. Outside the land, even though everything is connected to Hashem, purity cannot be fully attained because of the angels that rule over it. So he says, outside of the land, even if we act in the most noble, ethical fashion, there is some limitation. Because if spirituality is about connection to God, by definition, we're at a disadvantage outside of Israel because we are distant from God. Okay, this is the meaning behind what it says. They, the Kuthites, the Kusim, did not know the laws of the God of the land, and he sent against them the lions. What he's referring to is as follows. In the book of Kings, it discusses the king of Assyria exiling the 10 tribes, right? The 10 lost tribes, right? He gets rid of them. The way the Assyrians conquered a good chunk of the world in the ancient world was what they would do is very smart. They wouldn't just conquer a land. They would take the inhabitants of one land and bring them to another land, the inhabitants of that land bring them to this land, and vice versa. What's the rationale behind that? You're able to be in control. In other words, if you're in my home and you're fighting against me, A, I know the terrain, B, I have a sense of nationalism, it's my place. But if I go and I take you here, put you there, it all fizzles. And they did this. They're a pretty powerful empire, a ruthless empire. And so when they exiled the 10 tribes, they brought a group of people called the Kuthites, or the Kusim, and had them settle in the land of Israel. The Torah tells us that after a short while, they were getting attacked by lions. Left and right. These lions, these wild lions were coming and attacking them. And they're spiritual, they were in the ancient world. They weren't scientists, they were religious people. And they came to the Jewish inhabitants and said, what do we need to do? What's going on? And ultimately, you know what happened? They converted to Judaism. They converted to Judaism. Now, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud, because even in the times of the Talmud, this group of people still existed. There's a whole discussion, is that a valid conversion? Because the reason they converted was they were afraid of lions, right? If I have a gun to your head and I convert to Judaism, that's not exactly a choice, right? That's something, okay, but that's a discussion on its own. But he's saying as follows. Are the Kuthites Jewish prior to their conversion? Of course not, right? And yet, the lions are attacking them when they come into the land of Israel. Why aren't they getting attacked for their idolatry or whatever it is when they lived in their homelands? Says the Ramban, because the land of Israel is a land, you're in the palace. It demands a certain level of behavior. Whether you're a Jew or non-Jew, it demands a certain amount of a level of behavior because of your proximity to God. That's why only there were the Kuthites attacked. Okay? He says, and they were killing them because they did not know the laws of the land. They did not happen, and again, this did not happen to them in their own land, and when they served their idols. Only when they came to the land of Hashem and did their previous deeds did the lions kill them. Okay? So now, here's a question. If the purpose of the mitzvos, if we take this as logical conclusion, why are you keeping mitzvos? Why are you keeping mitzvos? Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a full whisper. Why are you keeping mitzvos? He says the reason God gave many of these laws is so that we'll be able to behave appropriately to live in the land of Israel, so we can connect to God properly and get all the benefits of living in the palace. We're not in the palace. Do we have an obligation to keep mitzvos here? Probably. We do. It seems like it. All right? Why? Why? If the purpose of the mitzvahs, right? He's taking this seriously. He's saying the reason, again, this is to me, such a paradigm shift in terms of why we keep mitzvahs. Normally we think of living in Israel is one of the 613 mitzvahs. And even that is debated. Some say it's a mitzvah. Some say it's not even a mitzvah. Some say it's not. The Rambam, Maimonides, it does not list living in Israel as a mitzvah, as a positive commandment. Okay? But one way or another, so at the very most, it's one mitzvah. The Ramban is saying, Nachmanides is saying, no, it's not one mitzvah. It is the purpose behind it, is the goal, is the objective of so many mitzvahs, are to enable us to live in Israel. It is the super mitzvah. It is the mitzvah that drives all other mitzvahs. The reason that you are given all these other mitzvahs is to ensure that you have the right to live in the land of Israel. That's wild. That's, first of all, that just changes our perspective of why Israel is so important. But it also, again, he's telling us the reason, but it also begs the question, why do I keep mitzvahs outside of Israel? So let's see what he says. He says, and it is written in the Tosefta, the final paragraph, as long as you are in Canaan, I will be for you a God. When you are not in the land of Canaan, I am, so to speak, not your God. Okay, it sounds like he's saying, yeah, you don't really have a relationship with God. Nonetheless, even though I'll exile you outside the land, keep the mitzvos, so that when you return, they will not be new. Keep the mitzvos outside of the land, okay, so that when you return to the land of Israel, they will not be new to you. New to you. So imagine, what he's saying over here is that the reason we are doing mitzvos here in Baltimore is it's just like it's training. It's like our training wheels, right? The reason is because when we get in Israel, you better keep the mitzvos. Imagine going through 2,000 years of exile and people weren't keeping mitzvos. And then 1948, they're like, okay, guys, we're coming back to Israel. Now we got to learn about Shabbos and about kashrus and this and that. It'd be impossible, right? So we held on to it. Why? So that when we return, we'll be able to keep the mitzvos. Kind of puts a damper on a lot of our mitzvah performance over here, right? I mean, basically saying that the main function is, and he says the main performance of the mitzvos is for those who live in the land of Hashem. The main function, you really want to connect to mitzvos, you really want to get the benefit of mitzvos, the purpose of mitzvos is really about the land of Israel. He points out two things from this. He says, there is a question that is asked. It's a question, which is about the forefathers doing things which are against the Torah. Okay, so the simple understanding is, when was the Torah given? The Jews after Egypt. The forefathers were not given the Torah, right? But some understand some suggest that the forefathers kept the Torah, in which case, let's ask a very basic question. Jacob goes ahead and marries two sisters. That's black on white, forbidden, can't do it. It says explicitly in the Torah. So the Ramban says, yeah, it's true, he married two wives, but guess what happened? When he re-enters the land of Israel, what's the first thing that happens? One of the wives die. He says this is not coincidental. This is, some divine plan to ensure, because outside the land of Israel, really, again, he's not, after the giving of the Torah, we don't have the right to say, well, I'm going to, marry two sisters. You can't do it. But before the giving of the Torah, on an intrinsic level, it's really only in the land of Israel that keeping mitzvos is really fundamental. Again, after the giving of the Torah, we don't have the right to just ignore mitzvos. But before the giving, intrinsically, keeping mitzvos is really only meant for the land of Israel. We do it so that when we get back to Israel, we're going to be fresh. Okay, and he points out, this also explains a dialogue after the destruction of the temple. We have a tradition that the Jewish people came to Ezekiel, the prophet, and said, we're done. We're out of the land of Israel. We don't have to keep mitzvahs. And Yechezkel argued, no, you got to keep mitzvahs. But it wasn't just like they were being lazy and they don't want to keep. They had a very good argument. They said mitzvahs are for Israel, right? So again, I find this piece both disheartening and inspiring at the same time. Disheartening because what does it say about our performance of mitzvahs over here? It's not the same. It's not the same. Again, it's still important. It's still good. We still have a connection to God, but it's not the same. But so he says, real mitzvah, the real purpose of mitzvahs is for Israel, but not just for those who live in Israel. But the reason God gave us all those mitzvahs is to enable us to stay in the land of Israel. That is the reason behind those mitzvahs. Again, it's not to say those mitzvahs don't have a moral character. It's not meant, but it just means that it's meant to elevate us, push us to act in a very elevated fashion, because we want to be in God's palace. We have to step it up. Okay? Yeah.
So it also means that those who do live in Israel are judged at a much higher standard.
That is absolutely true.
More likely to fail.
That is absolutely true. But it goes, it's like all good things in life, right? If I'm not in a relationship at all, then it's easy. I can't get burnt for being, making mistakes. If I'm in a relationship, I get the good and I get the challenges, right? So yes, we have it easier, they have it harder, but they also have the benefits. They go hand in hand. They have a closer relationship, and a relationship has different elements to it. Yeah. Yes.
There, apart from the issue of mitzvot and so on, isn't there also a different sort of theological problem here when the Ramban says, that there are certain areas where God has, as it were, chosen not to reign fully and has given over his malchut to these angels or mishartim who are servants. I thought that a lot of mainstream Judaism, we don't really believe that God delegates to servants and angels malachim in that way.
So it's a big debate. I think probably the more classic, I think nowadays, for whatever reason, there's a longer discussion about hashgacha, about how involved God is in our life. I think the medieval commentators certainly took an approach which understood that, at least for the masses, God is kind of step back and allows nature to run its course. So whether you want to call it nature, which is also not God running it, or you want to call it a mazel, it's the same idea. Basically, God is stepping back and saying, let things run as they're going to run, whether it's through these forces that have their nature, spiritual force has its nature, or it's called just gravity. Did God make this fall? Probably shouldn't have done that. Is God make that fall, or did gravity do it? It probably depends on your theological bend. But the Ramban would probably say, I'd argue the Ramban would say, it's just nature. God created nature. Okay, so yeah, sorry.
I just finished reading Derech Hashem.
Oh.
And okay, so Lisato, right? So
yeah, the whole thing. Wow.
He has a whole corporate system.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
God
yes.
is the
it's a good
CEO,
word. That's right.
There's a million
Correct.
low-level managers.
Correct.
Middle level, low level. I mean,
exactly. The Ramban and the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, are very much aligned in terms of broadly speaking, in terms of view. So again, to summarize, if someone were to ask us what's so important in the land of Israel, okay? So let's just review. We have a wide variety of answers. Some say the importance of the land is having the ability to have a society. Judaism is not meant to be practiced as an individual. Of course, if I'm stuck on an island, I'll still practice Judaism. But its ideal state is in a state. Its ideal state is to be practiced as a society, and that's why we need a land. Which lands? Okay, we need a land. There are others, Professor Litzur, who argues that the reason the land of Israel, there's something special about the land of Israel, specifically because of the fact that it's so complicated to live there, and therefore reminds us constantly of God's presence. Rav Hirsch argues that the importance is God chose it. If God chose it, by definition, it's important. Okay, and then we saw Rav Yehuda Halevi saying the vineyard example, and it's the soil. The only way to attain the benefit of the mitzvos is that if you want it, you got to plant the grapes in the right soil, and that is the significance of the land of Israel. And we have the Ramban Nachmanides saying not only is Israel a feature of Judaism, it's such a central feature. It's about living in proximity to God. Nowhere else do you have that proximity. And because of that proximity, that's why God gave us so many of the mitzvos, to ensure that we have the right behavior to be able to keep mitzvos, to the point that doing mitzvos outside of Israel, while it's still valuable, in some ways it's just practice to bring us back to the land of Israel, so that when we're there, we're able to have the right behavior so that we could connect to God and that we're not exiled from the land. Okay, so bottom line is, Israel's a pretty important place. That would be the very big summary. And God willing, next week we'll more or less pick up on this topic. Have a great day. Have a good Shabbos.